Welcome to Washington's Distillery. Building that you're in is a very faithful reconstruction of what Washington's distillery looked like. And we are on the very foundation of the original distillery. Now this distillery was actually first unearthed in 1932. And when it was unearthed, and they realized it was a distillery, they promptly buried it. Have any idea? Any guesses why? You got it. That's exactly right. There's actually articles from the time where there was mention of Washington having a distillery, and people were so incensed about the idea of our forefather being involved in that evil elixir of whiskey that they buried it. Well, it wasn't until the 90s until it was rediscovered. And when it was rediscovered, and we have recreated it exactly the same way, we actually found the outline, we found some flooring, we found some drainage channels underneath. And there are a few artifacts that you can see in the upstairs museum that were found on site. Now, Washington wasn't keen on starting a new business when he was given the idea about starting a whiskey business. It was in 1797 that his farm manager, James Anderson, approached Washington and said, "Look, you've got everything you need right here. You've got a mill, grinding grains, you've got the water that you need. We should be making whiskey." Well, Washington, at that time in his life, had just returned from the presidency, and he was in his 60s, and he was really looking to retire. He wasn't really looking to start a new business. But Mr. James Anderson was very insistent. And finally, Washington spoke to a friend of his that ran a tavern in Alexandria. He said, "Well, what do you think about the idea of me making some whiskey?" And his friend told him, "As long as you make it, and it's pretty good, you're going to sell it. People will buy it. You'll never be stuck with extra." So Washington told James, "Well, I'll do this. We'll let you have 2 stills, and we'll let you use some space in the cooperage," which was where they made barrels, which was on site here. We're not sure where. It was probably where the road is now. But I'll give you those 2 stills, and we'll see what happens. Well, that year, they made about 500 gallons and sold it quickly. Now, one very nice thing about whiskey is it was instant money. Washington could take that whiskey, load it up on a cart, take it down to Alexandria. It sold that day, and he had cash that night. Most of his other endeavors were long-term investments. He would send it out, and then you have to wait for it to make it to its location. And you have to wait for the merchant to sell it. Then you have to wait for him to make it back. And that's hoping he makes it back through those rough seas and survives. So he was what we would call land rich and money poor. So once that 500 gallons sold, and he made a big profit on it, he said to James, "All right, let's build you a distillery." Well, this distillery came into operation. It was started in the winter of 1797, and the building was done by the spring of 1798. It was one of the fastest buildings that was built on site in Mount Vernon. And does anybody have any guesses why? Because have you been to that 16-sided barn yet?
Yep.
A 16-sided barn took something like 2.5 years to build. This took 6 months. Big difference was, when the 16-sided barn was built, Washington was off running the country. He wasn't here. He was off in Philadelphia. And the winter of 1797 to 1798, Washington was here. Washington was a man who did not want to disappoint, and he was known to come right here regularly to see how it was coming along. So this building was ready in 1798, and in that year, they produced about 4,700 gallons of whiskey. And then in the year of 1799, nearly 11,000 gallons of whiskey. Now that, from the records we can tell, the ones that are in existence, and everything we can find, that made this the largest whiskey distillery in the States at that time. Now, the unfortunate thing happened at the end of 1799, and that was Washington's death. And production declined abruptly after that. And it was out of operation by 1806, I believe, and it burnt down in 1870. Now, this ended up in the hands of Lawrence Lewis, who married Nellie Custis, and he was not a very good businessman. The only real money he made from this place was after it burned down. There was an insurance claim on it. He had not been paying the premiums, and it is suspected that it was burnt down for insurance purposes. Now, he got a very small amount from the insurance company, which was basically a payoff to say, "Hey, go away," because he had not paid the insurance premiums since Washington had died. But that little encounter helped us out a lot in the restoration of this building, because then there were insurance records telling exactly how many stills, exactly how many barrels, what was the square footage, how many rooms, all that information we got from those records. So it was kind of good for us when it came time to reconstruct. So it's kind of the story of Washington's distillery. Now would you like to hear the story of how to make some whiskey?
Sure.
All right, get out your notebooks. This is the way you do it right. Now we actually do 2 whiskey runs a year here, and we employ all the methods and techniques of the 18th century. As you can see, we have no pipes or pumps or anything like that. It's all manual labor, which makes that whiskey taste extra good. Extra good. So the process starts. We have this tub here that we heat up the water to about 220 degrees Fahrenheit. Once it gets to that temperature, then we scoop it out, 1 gallon at a time. All right? And this barrel here, which we call a mash tub, only holds about 120 gallons. Right? So we have to scoop this 1 gallon at a time and to there. Now from here to there is not a big deal, but there are times that you end up having to go from here all the way to the corner, and it gets very tiring. I mean, 8 pounds on the end of this thing, and this thing's got a good bit of weight to itself. It starts adding up. So we start out, Washington's whiskey is rye whiskey, which means it has mostly rye in it. Yeah, it's made of 65% rye, 30% corn, and 5% malted barley. We start off, and as they did in Washington's day, you scoop your water, you put it in here, it's about 220 degrees. Then you add some rye, you add some corn, you know, the meal that's ground up, which we do grind it up in that mill that you've already visited in the same way it was then. Haul it over here and start making whiskey the same way it was back then. Now, we use this tool here called a mash rake, and it's not for mixing, it's for rowing. And you're like, well, what's the difference? Well, mixing, we can do this. When you add the rye and the corn to water, to that 220 degree water, it starts cooking out the starches. And it turns into the thickest oatmeal you have ever seen in your life. We can actually take this, put it about that far in there, let it go, and it'll stand. And we got to mix it. So you get that process row, and it is a full row, full body row to get it mixed. These little divots here are carved in there. They're worn in there. We've even broken one of these skins before in the process of yanking it. Now, imagine having to do that work all through the year to make 11,000 gallons. And that would have been done by slaves. Now, we cook out the starches, and we mix this mash and let it sit for about a day, so we can let it cool to about 140 degrees. We also mix it and rake, using the rake, and row it to help it cool. So we can end up rowing this one mash tub for hours and hours and hours and hours. Free workout. They don't have to pay for a gym. You just do this. Well, lucky for us, and once we get it down to 140, we add the malted barley. The malted barley takes and converts those starches to sugars, and it thins out the mix. So it gets a bit easier to row from then on. Then we have to row it for about another day, get it down to around 90 degrees. Once it gets right around 90 degrees, then we add the yeast. The yeast takes all those sugars, eats them up, and produces carbon dioxide and alcohol. That process can take anywhere from a day to 3 days. It just depends on how active the yeast is, how right our mix was, what the temperature is, what the outside temperature is as well. And then once it's done fermenting, we end up with what's called distiller's beer, which is about 3 or 4% alcohol. It tastes more like bread than it would any type of beer, because that's kind of what we've created. Now we get into a little bit more labor, and we have to take bucket by bucket from the mash tub to the still. We take it and we fill it up into the top there. When we fill these stills up, and he's got the image right there, if you show it to everybody, that's what those look like behind the bricks. Good job. We'll fill that up, and we'll take this head here, which is called an onion, and secure it to the top. And each of these carry different amounts. That big one at the end there, which we affectionately call Pam, she holds the most, I think, about 125 gallons. Some of these are as low as 70 or 80 gallons. But once we get it filled up to the right height, then we put the onion on and secure it in place. And we connect it up to this, what's called a worm tube. Now, the worm tube goes down into this worm tub and wraps around the edge of it all the way down and out the back of the tub. If you want, you can come take a look in here. And then once we've got it full, we'll start the fire up underneath. And we want to get it up to about 170 degrees. And that's the point at which alcohol evaporates. We don't want to go much over that because if we start getting too hot, then the water starts getting involved in the alcohol, and it just reduces the alcohol content. And we'll have to do it several times, which we do anyway. But you also have to worry about overheating it too, and there's something called puking. And what happens is that mash will get up into the onion and come out through the tube, and then it's just a horrible mess. And I've been lucky enough to not been involved when there was any puking. So once you get this alcohol boiling off, it builds up in here, the steam does, and then it creates pressure which forces it down into the worm tub here. And what we do with the worm tub is that gas, alcohol, we want to condense down back into a liquid. So we'll open up our valve here. We get fresh water flowing in, and that comes from the mill race, the same race that spins the wheel. And we have cool water coming in from the top, and then down on the bottom there, we have the warm water flowing out. So we have a constant flow so we can keep this cool. And it'll start condensing, and then our alcohol will start rolling out of the bottom here. Now, the first time it comes through, it ends up being about a 30 to 40 proof, which is not near high enough to actually sell as whiskey. So what you do is you take that 30 or 40 proof first distillation run, which they call low wine, and you put it in big casks, like you see back there. Then we have to take all that mash, which is the residual grains that has no longer any use for us for making whiskey, and we drain it out the back here. Now, have any idea, nowadays we just dispose of it, but have any idea what Washington may have done with it? Feed, exactly, hogs. Hogs love it. And in Washington's day, right there, well, there's no alcohol in it. We've already cooked all the alcohol off, so they don't get to enjoy that part of it. But they do eat it up like crazy. And Washington actually had pigs right behind here. I'm very thankful that we don't currently keep it that accurate because pigs stink. Well, it was known that Washington's hogs were well fed, but they were so well fed that a fellow was traveling through and his journal said that they were the largest pigs he had ever seen, and they were so fat and happy that their bellies drug the ground. And I would assume that they were because there's a lot of nutrition left in those grains when we're done with them. Well, now we've got a big cask of low wine, which is at 30 to 40 proof. We'll take it after we've cleaned out the still, load it back up, and run it through a second time. After running it through the second time, you're usually at 80 to 90 proof. And then there were special orders for what's called rectified whiskey, which they'd run through a third or fourth time to get up to 120 proof. That was for medicinal purposes only. And it'll cure whatever ails you. Now, in Washington's day, it would have been put right into a barrel and taken right to Alexandria and sold. The aging process was however long it took to make it to Alexandria. They didn't barrel whiskey in that day. Nowadays, we do barrel it. We do in charred barrels, so it gets that dark look. But we also do an unaged rye whiskey. When we do these runs, we do it twice a year. They sell it, and it goes for $90 a pint for the unaged, $180 for the aged. Wow. Now, initially, I was like, whoa, man, that's pricey. But after you do one run of making that whiskey, and we take about 3.5, 4 weeks to do it, you're like, wow, that's pretty cheap. Now, does anybody have any questions?
All the heating was done with wood,
With wood, yep, with fire.
And how much water did that hold?
That probably holds, I would say about 250, well, probably more like 300 gallons actually, because we'll end up filling one of those, and there's still plenty of water in there. We fill it back up and then let it heat up for the next.
Which has to take quite some time.
It's not really that too bad because you got half of the water's already heated. Yeah. And usually it gives us just enough time to get everything weighed out and get set up for the next barrel, because we're also maintaining fires at the time. We're also taking the whiskey that's coming out of the back into the buckets and we're transferring to other storage devices. We're filtering all that. So there's a lot of processes going on around here. Yeah, we're not just waiting for one mash tub. And it's a busy process, and it is fun for the first 2.5 to 3 weeks. That last week, you're like, oh, it feels like work.
Let me ask you, the whiskey that you produce, say you produce it twice a year here?
Yes.
Because already people waiting to buy it? Yeah.
We don't do a waiting list because it would be ridiculously full. What they do is they send out a email. I believe there's an email list that you can sign up for on the website. and they send out an email, and it's first come, first served. You have to be on site to purchase it. We don't ship it anywhere. And they also limit the amount of bottles that each individual can buy. That way somebody doesn't just come to the front of the line and buy all our stuff. Yeah, yeah.
How
So-
long is it from beginning to end?
The process for like, there are a few variables in there. Probably the biggest one as far as, I think the time would be how hot it is here, temperature-wise, because the warmer it is, the longer it's going to take to cool. Also, how active the yeast wants to be. Because sometimes we've converted all the sugars to alcohol in a day. Sometimes it's 3 days. Sometimes you get a day and a half into it, and then we add more yeast so that it can finish converting it.
Now, do you do this when they do it?
Yeah, we do it all here. And do it
Oh,
exactly.
you do it though, but I'm saying.
Yeah, personally, yeah. I've had that, yeah, absolutely. I've done it all. I've wrote it, I've burnt myself. I've got a couple burns on my arm from the hot water. I've earned my stripes when it comes to making some whiskey. But every step of the process I've been involved in. So, very exciting.
When you operational, do you allow crowds to come watch?
No, we don't. We do it when we're all in the off season because of all the liability and risk
I
involved.
would think so. I'm just curious what kind of smells you generate.
Oh, it's strange. It's like, I like the smell of it in the air. But after you've gotten that mash on your hands, which you will, like especially what comes out of the back of this thing, that smell will not wash off your hands. And I'll get home and, you'll wash and you bathe and you still smell like a distillery. It's like, if I got pulled over on the way home, no, I work in a distillery, I swear, smell this, Because it's, like when it's cooking in there, it almost has like bread, almost kind of like a bread smell. When it comes out of the backside after it's been cooked in here, it's not near as nice, and it's usually like that much char on the bottom.
Oh, wow.
That's a pain to get out of the stills.
Well, that's what I wonder, how do you get everything out of there?
We luck out and we have modern means to do that.
Ah.
Steam pressure washer.
Oh.
Now it is easier, but it is miserably hot.
Yeah.
And it's
Let me ask you something, you say you use that water comes from the mill.
Mhm.
Now, health-wise, how do you,
That water is only used for cooling.
Yeah, it's not-
Oh, okay.
The water that goes in there that we actually make the whiskey from
Okay, so-
would have come from a well, and comes from a well, and that's what this feeds into. In Washington's day, there was actually a well right here, and they just pump it, and it would flow in, and then they could toss the buckets of water in there. We also add hops to the initial water, and hops work as an antibacterial agent. And so with the hops in the water, anything that would be in there would be bad for you, would be gone. And then through the whole process of cooking it, and particularly distilling it, where we're really separating. 220 degrees, it kills those things. And then once we separate out the alcohol, and then actually before it gets bottled, it does go through a modern carbon filter.
Did they grow everything they needed on the farm?
Yes.
Or they didn't have to bring anything in?
Didn't have to bring anything in, it was all made here on site, all grown on site.
did you say you use slaves to do that?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. Was the farm manager, James Anderson, that suggested it to Washington, and he initially ran it, and then he had his son, John Anderson, run it. But as far as the labor went, it would have been all slave labor. And it is assumed, it's not assumed, that we can't find direct records of where the slave quarters were, but there would have been some on site so they lived nearby. And actually, if you go upstairs, there's a museum, and there's a little video that you can watch. And at the end of the hall are 2 bedrooms that are set up like it would have been in the day. And one would have been where John stayed, and the other may have been one of the higher-ups as far as the slaves went that would stay there.
Did they run year-round during that short time that they were?
They did that year, they would have had to make 11,000 gallons.
Absolutely.
So even in the heat of summer, honestly, they may have caught a break in the heat of summer. Because if it's over 100 degrees, you're never going to get that barrel down to the 90 degrees in heat. And they didn't have fans like we do to kind of move the process along. Which is a benefit for us too, that's why we do it in the fall, we do it in the spring before, football, whatever it is.
Very cool.
All right. And feel free to go on upstairs, and then once you've made your way to the end, it'll go through a bit of a modern part of the building, but it'll take you right down to the office. And there's also a replica of the ledger that would have been there, and that would have been where they actually would have kept the spirits so that nobody could wander in and take a little sniff.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.